On the afternoon of July 31, 1940, Adolf Hitler stood in the Reich Chancellery in Berlin and talked about war the way a gambler talks about a hot streak. France was down. The British had run for the Channel and left their equipment on the beaches. The map of Europe looked the way he had promised it would look when he took power. Borders erased, capitals bent, armies shattered in weeks. And in the middle of that triumph sat one idea that suddenly felt like a law of nature to him, not a tactic. Speed, shock, encirclement. The belief that if you moved faster than your enemy could think, the war ended before it really began. In the English-speaking world, they called it Blitzkrieg, lightning war. The phrase sounded like something Germany had invented in a laboratory and unleashed on the continent like a weapon. But the reality was messier. Blitzkrieg wasn't a neat official doctrine stamped and filed away like a regulation. Many historians treat it as a label that hardened after the fact, a shorthand for a style of operations Germany practiced with frightening success early on, built from older German traditions of maneuver and decisive battle rather than a single written manual called Blitzkrieg. That matters because Hitler didn't fall in love with a doctrine. He fell in love with a result. He trusted the result so much that he built his entire strategic worldview around the expectation that the next war would end like the last one, fast, violent, and final. Because the last one always had. And that is how World War II forced him into a kind of war he could not control. Not because he stopped believing in speed, but because speed stopped being enough. If you want to understand why Hitler trusted this approach so completely, you have to start with the pressure that created it. Germany in 1939 was not a country built for a long, grinding war against half the planet. Hitler had rearmed quickly, but quickly is different from deeply. His system was designed to seize what it needed, not to outproduce enemies who could afford to lose a battle, replace everything, and come back. His intuition, part ideology, part memory of 1914 to 1918, was that a prolonged war was poison. The First World War had dragged Germany into blockade, hunger, political collapse, and revolution. That trauma sat behind every decision he made, whether he admitted it or not. A long war meant the home front cracks first. A short war meant you never give the home front time to crack. So, when Germany smashed Poland in 1939 and then, in 1940, ripped through the Low Countries and France, it looked like history had handed him proof. Not proof that his ideology was right, proof that his method of war was right. France had not fallen because Germany had more tanks. In many categories, the Allies had plenty of tanks. France fell because the German attack produced paralysis. It turned the front into a series of emergencies so fast the Allied command system couldn't digest them. That sensation, an enemy collapsing not from total destruction, but from an overload of decision-making, became addictive. That's the first reason Hitler trusted it. It matched the kind of war he needed to fight. Germany had to win by not letting the war become what it truly was, a contest of industrial scale, logistics, manpower pools, and time. And the Imperial War Museum's explanation of Barbarossa says it bluntly in a way Hitler's own planning implied. Germany wasn't planning a long attritional war because it didn't have the reserves of men and material for one. It needed a quick victory. The strategy was a resumption of the same Blitzkrieg idea that had worked in France. You win by not fighting, by cutting off and collapsing the enemy rather than trading blows frontally. The second reason he trusted it is more personal. It reinforced his belief that will and audacity mattered more than caution and arithmetic. He loved operations that felt like defiance of expert warning. Every time his generals hesitated, every time bureaucrats explained risk, he remembered how risk had paid off. He remembered 1936, when he marched into the Rhineland, and France didn't move. Or he remembered Austria. He remembered Czechoslovakia. He remembered how bluff and momentum had become a form of power. Then he remembered May 1940, when the gamble through the Ardennes worked so well that even Germany's own leadership was surprised by the speed of the victory. It wasn't just a victory, it was validation. And once a leader is validated by speed, speed becomes a drug. You stop preparing for what happens when the drug wears off. That's why, by mid-1940, he was already looking past the war he was in and toward the war he wanted. Britain was still fighting. The English Channel sat there like a wall that his army couldn't simply drive around. Hitler ordered preparations for an invasion of England, but he was never fully committed to a seaborne landing. In part because Germany wasn't a sea power, and because the Royal Navy made the Channel more than just water. But there was another reason, stated plainly in the BBC's history essay. Britain did not contain the space or raw materials Hitler believed Germany needed, and he admired the British Empire even as he fought Britain. For him, invading Britain was a distraction from the real ideological target. The alternative to invading Britain was invading the Soviet Union. This is where the trap begins to close. Because the logic of the early war, the logic of Blitzkrieg as a pattern of success, didn't just say, move fast. It said implicitly that the enemy would collapse if you hit him the right way. It said you could decide wars by shattering command systems, by destroying field armies in pockets, by making governments lose nerve. It said the enemy would react like France, like Poland, like the Netherlands, like Belgium, like Yugoslavia, like Greece. A state with borders, with an army, with a capital that could be pushed into surrender once the field forces were broken and the political center was shocked. Hitler's worldview did the rest. He believed the Soviet state was rotten. He believed it would fall if kicked hard enough. The IWM piece captures the quote that crystallizes his confidence. The idea that all Germany had to do was kick the door in and the whole edifice will come crumbling down. And they planned on a fast campaign of 6 to 8 weeks. That is the moment where trust becomes dependency. Blitzkrieg wasn't just a method. It was the only kind of war that fit his timeline, his economy, and his ideology. If the Soviet Union didn't collapse quickly, but the entire German war plan didn't simply get harder. It became impossible, because a quick victory was not a preference. It was a requirement. On June 22, 1941, the invasion begins. 3 million men. Army Group North toward Leningrad, Center toward Moscow, South toward Kiev. The opening blows work in a way that seems like another chapter from 1940. The Luftwaffe catches the Soviet Air Force by surprise and destroys aircraft on the ground. German armor thrusts deep, encircling Soviet frontier armies. Huge numbers of prisoners. For weeks it looks like a machine designed to produce collapse is producing collapse again. The BBC history essay gives the scale in a way that sounds like an apocalypse measured on a clipboard. 1 week in, 150,000 Soviet soldiers dead or wounded. Kiev falls, 600,000 captured. By October, 3 million Soviet soldiers are prisoners of war. Even Stalin, according to that essay, was considering the possibility of suing for peace and had organized a getaway train as German guns pounded Moscow. His decision to stay and fight becomes framed as a turning point. From Hitler's chair, that looked like confirmation again. Not merely that he could win, that the world behaved the way his method said it would, and then the world refused to behave. The first crack was not weather, the first crack was arithmetic. Germany had underestimated the size of the Soviet Union's capacity to absorb disaster. The IWM account makes the point in a way that stings. Germany invaded with about 3 million men expecting the total Soviet army to be roughly the same. But by Christmas 1941, German armies had captured 3 million Soviet soldiers and were still fighting. That sentence should be engraved on the inside of Hitler's skull because it explains the whole transformation from controllable war to uncontrollable war. Blitzkrieg depends on the enemy running out of organized forces to continue the fight. If you can bag 3 million prisoners and the enemy keeps generating new armies, the war doesn't end. It expands. it becomes a furnace. And when the furnace turns on, speed becomes fuel consumption. As German spearheads drive deeper, the distances become more than geography. They become a supply problem that grows faster than the Army can solve it. The IWM essay describes those vast distances, making German forces more and more difficult to supply. And it also describes a problem that is easy to miss if you're drunk on encirclement maps. Pockets of Soviet troops behind German lines become a real threat, attacking lines of communication. In other words, the very act of racing forward creates a rear that is not secure. The front becomes porous. This is where Hitler begins to lose control, even if he feels like he's asserting it. Because a war you can control is a war where your decisions create predictable outcomes. A war you can't control is a war where every choice produces second and third order effects you cannot contain. He pauses Army Group Center's drive on Moscow to help clear pockets left and right. The IWM account frames this as Hitler stopping the attack on Moscow and peeling off forces against protests from generals, to finish battles of annihilation and destroy Soviet pockets, still fighting. It succeeds tactically, more Soviet troops killed or captured, but it buys the Soviets time. The pause allows the Soviets to redefine their front and dig in before Moscow. When the offensive restarts, it runs into a new defensive line. This is a theme you see again and again in Hitler's war. He chooses a tactical certainty over a strategic risk, and the strategic cost quietly compounds until it becomes fatal. Then the weather begins to do what weather always does. It turns plans into jokes. The IWM explanation walks you through the degradation like a slow mechanical failure. October brings the muddy morass of autumn. Snowfall, thaw, roads dissolving, movement grinding down. Armored formations at the tip of the spear drop to about half strength. And then, by the end of November, winter hardens. The Germans are 20 kilometers from Moscow. Suddenly, there are more troops in hospital with frostbite than with wounds. And then the Soviets reveal the part Hitler never truly believed in: reserves, relocation, replacement, production. Factories move east to the Urals. The IWM essay mentions relocation and the arrival of new tanks like the T-34. The Soviets absorb the early shock and convert the war into what Germany feared most: a war of production. That phrase, war of production, is the point where Hitler's trust in Blitzkrieg becomes a curse, because it was built for a world where war ends before production matters. Now he is in a world where production matters more than brilliance. And if you want to see the exact moment when World War II becomes uncontrollable for him, it's December 6, 1941, the Soviet counterattack in front of Moscow. The IWM account describes Siberian divisions transferred west once Stalin learned Japan would not attack. These are winter-trained troops with camouflage and gear, facing exhausted Germans. The counteroffensive catches the Germans by surprise and forces them onto the retreat. Barbarossa ends. Hitler's first defeat on land. From that point forward, he is no longer conducting a war with clear endpoints. He is managing a crisis that multiplies. He is fighting a state that does not collapse when it loses armies. He is fighting geography. He is fighting the calendar. He is fighting industrial mismatch. And because his entire strategic identity is built on speed, he responds by trying to force speed onto problems that cannot be solved by speed. And that's where you see him reach for the old lever again, a new offensive in 1942. The IWM essay notes that despite Barbarossa's failure, a new offensive begins, with Hitler insisting on the Caucasus oil and Stalingrad, while generals prefer renewed focus on Moscow. Hitler's insistence reveals something important. He has realized, even if he doesn't fully admit it, that this is a war of attrition and material now. He is reaching for oil because oil is endurance. Oil is the ability to keep moving. And movement is still the language he trusts. But notice what that decision also reveals. He is no longer choosing goals that end the war. He is choosing goals that keep the war going. That is what it means to be forced into a war you cannot control. Your objectives change from victory to survival. But you keep talking like you're chasing victory. Or you keep believing the next thrust, the next blow, the next one more campaign will restore the old pattern. You keep trying to recreate the early war shock, even though the enemy has learned how to absorb shock. The BBC essay adds another layer to why the East becomes a trap. Hitler had strategic reasons to think knocking out the Soviet Union would end the wider war, because it would remove the greatest threat from the East before Britain, America, and the Soviet Union could align fully. It quotes a German staff officer describing the cold logic: if Germany waited, it would face all three at once. So Germany had to try to remove the threat from the East while it still seemed possible. This is the paradox. The invasion of the Soviet Union is sold as rational, preventative, strategic. It is also, simultaneously, and the most reckless bet Germany could make if the quick win assumption fails. And it does fail. So the rational decision turns into a permanent emergency. At this point, you might think, so the story is simply Hitler trusted Blitzkrieg, and Blitzkrieg didn't work in Russia. That's too simple. Blitzkrieg, whatever you call it, did work in the opening months. It was devastating. The BBC essay explicitly says the German Blitzkrieg technique was as devastating in Russia as it had been elsewhere. The real problem is that Hitler trusted it as an end-state machine. He believed it created collapse, but the Soviet Union didn't collapse. It changed form. It became uglier, harsher, more brutal, but it stayed in the field. It turned into a system that could lose millions and keep generating divisions. And when that happens, the German method creates a new kind of war, a war where the front line is 1,000 miles long, where every mile gained adds miles of supply line, where every encirclement consumes fuel and time, and where the enemy can trade space for time because space is exactly what he has. That's why, after 1941, Hitler begins to reach for control through micromanagement. Because when you can't control the strategic environment, you start trying to control the operational details. You start issuing orders about cities, about rivers, about stand fast, about which army goes where. You start treating war like a map puzzle again, because the alternative is admitting that the war is now a system with its own momentum. The BBC essay, later in its narrative, describes Hitler demanding divisions stand fast to the last man later in the war, mirroring the disastrous early war Soviet tactic. It also describes the scale of Soviet operations like Bagration and the eventual hoisting of the red flag over the Reichstag. But the deeper point is not the final defeat. The deeper point is the transition. The moment the war becomes beyond his ability to shape. To understand why he couldn't control it, you have to understand what control looked like to him in the early period. Control meant dictating the tempo. Control meant forcing the enemy into reaction. Control meant winning before the enemy could mobilize fully. Control meant short campaigns that ended in political decisions. Look at 1940 in the West. Germany achieves a victory so fast it feels like the laws of war have been rewritten. The Imperial War Museum's Blitzkrieg explainer uses language that captures why the myth took hold. In 1940, Germany did the seemingly impossible, taking France in weeks and pushing the British back across the Channel, a success widely put down to this new tactic, lightning war. When you win like that, you start believing the enemy's collapse is a product of your genius rather than a combination of your strengths and the enemy's weaknesses and mistakes. You start believing the method works universally. You stop seeing that it relies on conditions: air superiority, operational surprise, logistical reach, enemy command rigidity, terrain, weather, and above all the enemy's inability to replace his field armies quickly. Hitler learned the wrong lesson. He learned we can do the impossible. He did not learn, "We were almost broken ourselves if this had lasted longer." Because in the early Blitzkrieg campaigns, Germany's economy and manpower could sustain the cost. Losses were painful but not existential. Equipment could be repaired. Fuel could be found. Ammunition expenditure was high but manageable. Most importantly, the campaigns ended before the slow bleeding began. In the Soviet Union, the slow bleeding begins immediately, but it is disguised by early success. That's why this story is so dangerous. It looks like it's working right up until it stops working, and by the time it stops, you can't undo the choice. You can't uninvade a continent, and Hitler cannot emotionally tolerate that reality. So he keeps trying to force the war back into the shape he understands. The decisive campaign, the encirclement, the seizure of the enemy's center. The problem is that a state like the Soviet Union does not have a single center you can take that ends the war. Moscow matters, Leningrad matters, Kiev matters, Stalingrad matters, the Caucasus oil matters. But none of them, individually, is a kill switch. The Soviet system is distributed. It is brutal. It is redundant. It can retreat and still exist. So Hitler's trust in Blitzkrieg becomes a kind of strategic blindness. He keeps looking for the kill switch because that's what the early war taught him to expect. When he doesn't find it, he doubles down. And doubling down in the East means stretching further, committing more, bleeding more, and making the war larger. You can see this in the 1941 planning itself. The IWM essay notes the German plan aimed at 3 different targets with 3 army groups. That split is often defended as necessary, but it also reflects a belief that the enemy would collapse under simultaneous pressure. If the enemy doesn't collapse, splitting the effort becomes a long-term problem. 3 directions, 3 supply networks, 3 sets of requirements, and no single decisive point. And when the enemy doesn't collapse, the war becomes something Blitzkrieg was never designed to solve on its own: the management of sustained combat power over time across vast distances. That is logistics. That is production. That is replacement. That is winter clothing. That is rail gauge conversion. That is fuel and spare parts. That is the boring machinery that decides wars when the first shock fails. That is also the type of war Hitler's system was least suited for, because it was built on mobilizing society for a political project, not on optimizing resources for a long industrial grind. Germany could produce immense amounts of weapons later, but the key point is timing. Hitler wanted the world before his enemies reached full production capacity. The BBC essay's framing of the strategic clock, Britain, America, and Russia being ready by 1942 to 43, captures this fear directly. So in 1941, he bets everything on speed. In late 1941, the bet fails. Now the clock he feared begins to run against him faster than ever. This is where the war becomes uncontrollable in a very specific sense. In 1939 to 40, Hitler was choosing wars. He chose the timing, the sequence, to the targets. After 1941, the war chooses him. It forces him to respond to crises he created and crises his enemies create. He is no longer dictating the tempo. He is trying to survive it. It's important, too, to recognize that the East is not just a military contest. It becomes a war of annihilation, a political and racial project that destroys any possibility of pragmatic compromise. The BBC essay describes it as a scene set for a war of annihilation waged by the Nazis against the Soviets, with no mercy shown by either side. It details brutality on all sides, partisans, starvation, draconian occupation, and later Stalingrad's ferocity, where Soviet tactics deliberately fought close to deny German advantages. That matters for Hitler's control problem because annihilation wars don't end cleanly. They don't end with negotiated terms because the goals are existential. If you fight a war where you intend to enslave or destroy, the enemy has no reason to accept your terms even after catastrophe. He fights on because surrender is worse than death. So even if Blitzkrieg creates disasters, the disasters don't translate into political collapse the way they did in the West. That's not a tactical problem. That is a moral and political design choice that guarantees endurance from the enemy. Now let's get to the heart of your title. Why Hitler trusted Blitzkrieg so much until World War II forced him into a war he couldn't control. He trusted it because it suited Germany's weakness, because it matched his personality, because early campaigns rewarded risk, and because it aligned with his ideological expectation that enemies were hollow and would crumble. But World War II forced him into an uncontrollable war for three main reasons that all feed each other. First, the enemy didn't collapse. The Soviet Union absorbed the shock, relocated industry, mobilized reserves, and continued fighting despite catastrophic losses. Both the IWM and BBC accounts underline the scale of Soviet losses and continued resistance, and the relocation of factories east. Second, the war became a war of production and attrition, the kind of war Germany needed to avoid. The IWM essay explicitly states that Hitler needed a fast victory because Germany could not afford a slow attritional war, and that Barbarossa's failure forced Germany into a war of attrition. Third, geography and logistics punished the very method he relied on. Speed magnified supply problems. The deeper the advance, the more fragile the spearheads became. The IWM narrative ties the German pause, supply difficulties, pockets behind lines, and weather into a chain that ends at Moscow's gates and then snaps. Once those three forces lock together, Hitler is no longer conducting a campaign. He is trapped in a system where each attempt to regain initiative requires resources he cannot regenerate fast enough, and each failure makes the next attempt more desperate. And that desperation changes his relationship with his own generals and his own army. In a controllable war, Hitler could let professionals fight while he claimed political credit. In an uncontrollable war, he starts to fear the professionals because their caution sounds like defeatism. He starts to override them because he believes that daring is the only thing that saved Germany before. He begins to treat the war like it can be willed back into the shape of 1940 by force of decision. And because he is the supreme decision-maker, the entire German system begins to revolve around his insistence that one more push will solve the structural problem. You can see the seed of that in the way Barbarossa was framed. The IWM essay notes Germany planned 6 to 8 weeks. That's not just optimistic. That is a plan built on the assumption of collapse. When you plan like that, you don't build the infrastructure for a long war. You don't stockpile winter equipment at scale. You don't prepare rail conversion capacity to match the distances. You don't prepare for a Soviet army that keeps appearing after you destroy it. So when reality deviates, your entire war machine becomes improvisation. And improvisation at that scale is not control. It's firefighting. Now, because you asked for the exact competitor tone and approach, let me do what that script does so well. Bring you into a single moment that symbolizes everything. Picture that December morning outside Moscow in 1941. German troops are exhausted. Vehicles are freezing. Men are wrapping rags around boots. The offensive is already dying. Hitler still believes the final shove will crack the city because in his mind, that is the pattern. Then the Soviets counterattack, not with desperate militia, but with fresh divisions trained for winter warfare, moved from the Far East because Stalin learned Japan would not attack. In that moment, Hitler's trust in speed meets a kind of power speed cannot defeat. Depth. Depth of manpower. Depth of space. Depth of production capacity. Depth of willingness to suffer. Depth of political ruthlessness. Depth of winter. That is when the war stops being something he can win by forcing a decision. It becomes something he can only win by outlasting, outproducing, and outresourcing enemies who are better positioned to do all three. And if you're Hitler, that is not just a military problem. That is a threat to the entire mythology you built your regime on, the myth that Germany's will and genius can overcome the world's numbers. Blitzkrieg had made that myth feel true. Moscow makes it feel fragile, so he does what leaders do when the world stops confirming their worldview. He hardens, he doubles down. And he searches for another decisive campaign. He looks south to oil and to Stalingrad, trying to solve the endurance problem by seizing the resource that fuels endurance. But that is not control either. That is chasing the ability to keep chasing. And here's the cruel part. Even if Hitler had been a perfect general from 1942 onward, he still would have been trapped by the structural mismatch his early strategy created. Because by launching a war of annihilation in the East and continuing a war in the West, he ensured Germany faced enemies with larger combined industrial bases. His early faith in rapid victory was the only thing that made that situation seem survivable. Once rapid victory failed, the underlying imbalance became destiny. This is why the title's word trusted matters. Trust is not analysis. Trust is belief. Hitler trusted Blitzkrieg the way people trust a superstition that happened to work 3 times in a row. He trusted it because the early war rewarded him for trusting it. He trusted it because it allowed him to ignore the kind of war Germany could not win. And when the war turned into that kind of war anyway, it didn't just defeat his armies. It defeated his method. Even the way we talk about Blitzkrieg today is part of the story. It became a legend because the early successes were so dramatic, they begged for a single explanation, a single word. But Blitzkrieg as a label can hide the fact that Germany's early victories were not magic. They were situational. And Hitler treated them as universal. That is how the war becomes uncontrollable. When you mistake a situational advantage for a law of nature, you build your entire strategy on the assumption that the law will always hold. Then you meet an enemy and an environment that break the assumption, and suddenly every plan you have is built on a foundation that no longer exists. By 1944, as the BBC essay describes, the Soviet advance makes invasion of Germany a real possibility, and Hitler orders destruction of anything the enemy could use, turning against his own people in bitterness. That's the end point of a leader who began the war believing he could shape Europe with momentum and ends the war trying to control even the ruins of his own retreat. So if you want the simplest version without simplifying the truth, it's this. Hitler trusted Blitzkrieg because it gave him what he needed, a way to win before Germany's weaknesses mattered. The World War II forced him into a war he couldn't control when the Soviet Union survived the initial shock and turned the conflict into a war of production, distance, weather, and endurance. Precisely the kind of war Germany could not afford, and the kind of war no amount of speed could end. The early victories didn't just encourage him, they trained him, and when the war changed, he couldn't change with it fast enough.